coming to this community discussion on the question, is this fascism? And if so, what can we do about it? Can you hear me? Is the microphone working well? And there's another microphone here. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Okay, so my name is Eric Levy-Jacobson, and I'll be the host for tonight's discussion. I know many of you, so it's a little, it's nice to see so many familiar and friendly faces. And so this discussion is sponsored by a project called the Vermont Center for Social Research. And the Vermont Center for Social Research is an entirely new educational project that came about for a number of reasons, but in part because of the decline of the numerous liberal arts colleges in Vermont and across the United States. It's an epidemic of closures. Goddard College is really just one of hundreds that have closed, which really, you know, the idea of the liberal arts college was part of this democracy in education and public education tradition. And with the closure of that also comes a number of consequences. And so this project is really an attempt to reinvigorate the discussion of public learning for democracy that was the hallmark of Vermont's higher education tradition. So to that end, we're going to be offering a series of classes online and in person that'll be open to the public. So our first class begins in January called The Philosophy of Fascism, which you can find by going online. So that's a course that I've taught for many years at Middlebury College, I think almost 10 years now. But this will be the first time that it'll be offered in this kind of public or communal format. So it's a class where we read the German Jewish refugees who came to America in the 1940s and who tried to record their observations of fascism here, you know, in the US after the fact. Can you hear me? Is it hard to hear me?
Why don't you stay close to the microphone?
Okay, I'll try. Remind me if I walk away from it. Or what if I take it like this? Okay. All right. So the idea of the Vermont Center for Social Research is to bring these types of public education courses out of elite universities where many of us have taught, or colleges, or all of these different formats, and not elite universities, too, and to make this kind of study available to the public. In short, we don't think higher education should mean burdening the public with lifelong debt while endowments rise to billions of dollars. We're looking for other ways to fund education for democracy, so this is really an open invitation to everyone here. And so you can find out about the course and you can register by visiting the website online, which is vtsr.org, so VT for Vermont and socialresearch.org. Okay, so allow me to explain the idea for tonight's discussion. There'll be three parts. I'd like to begin with a few words about the philosopher Hannah Arendt and her advice to us in these troubled times. And I'll introduce her to you through her 1964 lecture entitled Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship. The second part of our discussion tonight will be a Q&A with invited contributions from members of the community. We have tonight Otto Müller, Tama Weissman, and Eric Bachman. And in the third part, it's really an open discussion for your thoughts and impressions. Let me just take a moment in gratitude to Janiza Grill, who couldn't be here tonight, who also lives in central Vermont. Janiza is a master translator and contributed to this brand new, lovely, bilingual volume of the poetry of Hannah Arendt entitled What Remains? The Collected Poems of Hannah Arendt, which is published by Norton and just came out this year. So I just wanted to give a little plug. It's really quite beautiful, and she did tremendous work in translating that. And I'm sorry she couldn't be here tonight. Before I turn to Arendt, let me just also thank the Kellogg Hubbard Library for offering us this wonderful room to meet. And thank you to Orca Media, who'll be joining us for the first part of the evening's discussions. Okay, so they're recording my remarks, which will be available online and for rebroadcast on their network. After my remarks, they'll stop recording so we can create an atmosphere for community discussion in the second and third parts of the evening. For all of you here, and thank you for everyone here who's come. It's a tremendous turnout, I think. We've definitely filled almost all of the chairs. And your participation tonight also should be noted as an act of courage in this atmosphere. So thank you for coming. So let me turn to Hannah Arendt now. Arendt was one of the German Jewish refugees who I mentioned earlier, who, upon reaching the shores of America in 1941, began thinking and writing about fascism, which she had experienced in Germany and then later as a refugee in France. Her monumental work was a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. Okay, it's working. That was published in 1951. She taught political philosophy at the New School for Social Research, also called the New School University in New York, and she died in 1975. Arendt speaks of totalitarianism in that book because she wanted to compare Nazism with Stalinism. And in that sense, she's using a larger category when she talks about totalitarianism. But what is true for totalitarianism is certainly true for fascism. And so therefore, for the purposes of our discussion here, I tend to use the terms fascism, National Socialism, authoritarianism, Nazism, and even totalitarianism in the same breath and often as fascism. Doesn't mean that they're all the same, obviously, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'm using them interchangeably. For Arendt, the commonality which distinguishes fascist forms of government from other forms of dictatorship and tyranny is a system of government based on fear, and she uses the term terror. Fascism is a government of fear. Many of us, all of us, have been growing more and more fearful of the current administration. And so that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to bring folks together and try and understand a little bit more about the nature of governments of fear, how they work, and what we might be able to expect going forward, and what types of responses are available to us. Terror is the center point of fascist forms of government. One of the key features of fascist leadership, says Arendt, is the fostering of an atmosphere in which all opinions are irrelevant and all individuals are superfluous. She spends a lot of time on these categories in the third part of her Origins of Totalitarianism. In that third section of the Origins of Totalitarianism, the fascist leader argues for the irrelevance of all opinions, and then, according to her theory, chooses from an open field of existing opinions in his movement. For positions, obviously he must have positions, yet he chooses them without any real belief in any opinion. Exhibiting what she says, demoralizing fascination in the possibility that gigantic lies and monstrous falsehoods could eventually be established as unquestioned facts. The difference between truth and falsehood may cease to be objective and become a mere matter of power and cleverness, of pressure and infinite repetition. holding on to these assumed positions in an absolute resolute fashion, although believing in none. Fascism seeks to create a form of decisionism. Let's see if I can turn it up a little. The decision itself is more important than the content of these decisions. The aim is simply radical for its own sake. The goal is the destruction of all previous ethical and legal norms. Take, for example, the pardoning of that disgraced former New York Congressman, George Santos. That happened last week, right? The decision to pardon Santos is not because of his relevance or benefit for the movement, obviously, right? There are surely sufficient charlatans and criminals in the movement already. The decision to pardon Santos is, in fact, precisely for the arbitrariness of his being pardoned, the meaningless of it all, and the meaningless of all concepts of law and judgment. And this is really what Arendt is talking about, and it was, I have to say, ununderstandable in all these years that I've been working on this until now. And that's a bit of the shock, right? You look at something over and over, you think you're understanding, and you have no idea what it means until it's in front of you. So in fact, if all judgment is meaningless and all communication is irrelevant, then the decision in the form of a command is venerated as the most important feature of the fascist ruler. And not even he matters, according to Arendt. And this is also remarkable, right? The only thing that matters is the command, which is a fully political, theological construct. And this is really one of the interesting parts of Arendt's thesis, which is something which was only possible to, understand in the present situation, and perhaps it's hard to deal with entirely here, right now. But the leader is even himself irrelevant, she argues. And can you imagine 1940, she's writing it, 1950s, where the Führerprinzip, if you're familiar with that term, the concept of the Adolf Hitler is the explanation for everything, and she's writing, he was actually irrelevant. Totally ununderstandable until now. The leader draws his opinions from the vastness of opinions of the masses, she argues. He has no opinion of his own. And the masses, which is a term that since the 1970s has fallen out of use but should be reconsidered, can refer to a group of people who we could call, or we might call, the excluded middle. Often the overwhelming majority of a population unrepresented by the by the state. The magnitude of the excluded middle in each case, but especially in the US, makes them always a target of authoritarianism and authoritarian organizations. The system of fear and terror, which originate in what she calls the chaos of opinion, aims not only to eliminate opinion and the meaning of opinions, but also eliminate the grounds of all law, the difference between criminality and legality. It purports to hold a higher form of legitimacy above the law. And here's another essence of the difference between fascist totalitarianism and other forms of tyranny. She says, totalitarianism differs from other forms of political oppression known to us, such as despotism, tyranny, and dictatorship. Wherever it rose to power, it developed new political institutions and destroyed all existing social, legal, and political traditions. If tyranny means the absence of the rule of law, fascism means a form of government which undermines the very foundations and basis of law, institutionalizing a form of professional lawlessness and criminality into government itself. The purpose of professional law, this is her argument. The purpose of professional lawlessness, the purpose of it is to send decent, liberal, humanistic people into shock and horror, and therefore into retreats, and to create further elements of atomization that Arendt identifies at the beginning or the entrance of a government of fear into the realms of private life. So the purpose of this is to create further forms of atomization, which Arendt denotes with the simple category of loneliness. Very simple, but also rather profound. And what she discusses is how common forms of loneliness becomes the common ground for terror and the essence of totalitarian government.
This is a question. Is the term atomization?
I said atomization, yeah. To be reducing people to little parts, right? We're all being reduced to little parts. And in that, we're purposely, the purpose of that is to generate loneliness. That's her argument. So fascism is the idea of institutionalizing lawlessness and criminality into government and working not only to close out public life, the kind of thing here where we're actually trying to understand what's happening as a communal group, right? Which is also what tyrannical forms of government do, but also to reach into private life, right? Not only with regards to categories we're familiar with so far, women's reproduction, trans people, migrants, Palestinians. These are elements of the destruction of public life and rule of law, but a government of fear reaches further into the basis of life itself in an attempt to cultivate loneliness, the impressions of superfluousness, and to destroy the communal systems and attempts at mutual aid. So if dictatorships are temporarily suspensions of the rule of law within a system that permits exceptions, fascism is aimed at the destruction of the system itself and the destruction of individual or private life. This is her argument. If these observations of Arendt are true, or at least worthy of discussion, then we can begin to expect and respond to some of the features that we're seeing in our time. And in this context, we can situate and discuss her advice in personal responsibility under dictatorship, which is in the book Responsibility and Judgment and is also available online through our website. Oh, I brought one too. Thank you for and we have the same one too. Same edition. So rather than trying to discuss all of the features of her lecture, which took place in 1964, and others are going to be here also to talk about pieces of it, in the beginning, she's responding to her book on the trial, the war crimes trial of Adolf Eichmann, right? I'd like to say just a few words about personal responsibility in terms of what we can do, right? Which is a counterpart in some ways to what we've discussed so far, the government of fear that is oriented to the invasion of the basis of mutual life, communities, mutual aid, and private life itself. Arendt wishes to explain something that I think we should be on high alert for. She attempts to articulate what she discovered in Germany after the war. People who had the least responsibility for what happened, young people who weren't even alive at the time, were expressing absolute remorse to her, while the actual perpetrators of crimes against humanity were living and working and continuing in their jobs in post-Nazi Germany with no remorse whatsoever. And one of the things that Arendt tries to articulate in this piece, which I think is very crucial for our time, is the difference between being compelled to do something and finding incentive or opportunity in joining forces with what was then called the wave of history, or the force of history, or, in other words, fascist government, or attempting to appease it, or institutions modifying their views on equity and justice in quiet cowardice, in advanced compliance with fascist demands. So there is a difference between participation and non-participation, and a position which Arendt often heard in post-war Germany, the conflation of being forced to do something and consenting to do something. In fact, she argues there is no such thing as obedience among adults. What is referred to as obedience is in fact consent. And this is part of her argument. Those who participated in fascism as a lesser of two evils, to somehow mitigate the abuses of fascism, to lessen the extremes, claiming that it would be irresponsible not to participate in the Nazi Party from this point of view, to reduce the extremes, often failed to see that the lesser of two evil arguments was built into the system of terror itself, she argued. In choosing the lesser of two evils, one quickly forgets that one has already chosen evil at all. Often these views were articulated with the same German high-mindedness that has always been associated with moral behavior in civil society, she argues. And yet people quickly change their views, and all that remains are the forms of high-mindedness, she warns, the formulas, as it were, without any of the content, the feeling of doing right while not doing right at all. The opposite of formulaic high-mindedness is the cultivation of judgment, she argues, which is really what we do in philosophy. For although we may feel metaphorically bad for the country or ashamed of America today, there really is no such thing as collective guilt or collective responsibility in a moral or legal sense. Judgment, which means discussing and debating what is wrong and right, and I suppose coming to some conclusion, is an important feature of mutual aid to cultivate ourselves against fascism. This is something that we all need to do together. None of us does this alone. The opposite, the feeling of the impossibility to judge anything, because everything has no value, everything is fake news, is a condition of what she calls the chaos of opinion. Ultimately, it's the ideology of fascism. So how does one form moral judgments in the breakdown of all standards? Right? How does one do this? We may grant Arendt that there's no such thing as collective responsibility other than in the most generalized sense of the responsibilities of states. Political responsibility, which is possible, she argues, presupposes a modicum of power, which is not always true under dictatorship. But personal judgment is a form of power that always remains. And in the end, non-participation, which we'll talk about more later, is also a form of action. Because she argues, in the end, we have to live with ourselves. Thinking is what we do with ourselves, how we make do with ourselves. Non-participation with fascism at its most basic level is a program for how to face ourselves and live with our friends and neighbors in the future once this nightmare is over. Because we really do need to work with each other to survive this moment. And indeed, because one day, like in Germany in 1945, this moment will pass as well. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate being able to present that to you. And so now what I'd like to do is thank Orca Media once again for the recording of the first part of the evening's discussions. And while Orca packs up, and I will give you the microphone, I'll remind you once again that if you're interested in working on this predicament and these problems, and you're interested in reading the authors, you're really welcome to join us. And please visit the site. I don't have it up here anymore, but it's vtsr.org.